Um, I think we've had two excellent presentations, which I agreed with entirely, and saved me from having to say a lot of what I would have said. And I won't repeat what we've heard. Um, I think the most important thing to say is I think this is a defensive move. And this is a defensive move by government ministers concerned for their own position if they don't do this. They received very strong advice internally from the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office's legal advisors that it would be illegal to continue to grant arms export licenses to Israel when they're probably being used in breach of international humanitarian law. And of course, we can all see they're in breach of international humanitarian law. And I think the first thing to say is that this is not going to stop the genocide in Gaza. You know, the genocide in Gaza is well advanced. It's part of a genocide that's been lasting over 70 years. It's just a more accelerated phase at the moment. And none of this is going to stop Israeli atrocities, unfortunately. And that's true of the entire ICJ process. But what we are seeing is how the ICJ process works through eventually into law in various countries and into legal systems in various countries. Because in 2 or 3 years' time, the ICJ will come up with a definitive ruling that Israel is committing genocide presently. And it's very important to note that complicity in genocide is not only illegal in international law, which of course it is. Complicity in genocide is specifically a crime in UK domestic law. There was a Genocide Act passed in, I think, the 1960s. That was replaced by the International Criminal Court Act in the 2000s. But the International Criminal Court Act makes complicity in genocide a criminal offence in UK domestic law. Once the ICJ rules there has been a genocide, it then puts a minister who has continued to supply arms against his legal advice in a very dangerous position of personal danger of conviction under UK criminal law. They don't worry too much about it. You know, they're not scared of international law as being a case of personal jeopardy to them. They feel a certain amount of impunity there. But if David Cameron, when he was Lord Cameron, when he was foreign minister of the last Conservative government, he ignored the legal advice. He got the same legal advice that was available to David Lammy. He decided to ignore it. I don't see how he's going to avoid prosecution for complicity in genocide once the ICJ rules there has been a genocide. What David Lammy has done is do the absolute minimum that they think might be able to get them off the hook of personal liability, the complicity in genocide, while still maintaining their support for Israel. And nobody should be in any doubt at all that Keir Starmer and David Lammy are full supporters of this genocide, because they are. Please don't be confused by this token, pretty meaningless measure, which is, as we've heard, only affects 8% of UK arms exports to Israel, doesn't affect the F-35 production, for example. And one reason for that, of course, is that it's not just to support Israel. The calculation will have been within the UK government that if they were to block F-35 components going to the United States, that might prevent Lockheed Martin and the United States from buying UK components for future projects. If the UK were to block American military weapons being used in pursuit of American foreign policy by showing an independent foreign policy agenda, which is something, of course, the UK almost never does. That's why this is so token. I'm quite certain that messages have been going across to Washington saying, look, we've got to do this for security from our own domestic legislation and for domestic political reasons, but don't worry, we're not actually affecting anything real. This isn't having an effect in the real world. So this is token, this is fake, and at the same time, it's an attempt by ministers to secure their personal position against personal criminal liability.
Mr. Craig, thanks very much. And since you have brought up this issue of domestic legal background of this decision, since it's new to all of us, can you elaborate about this? Do you think they really might have something like or this decision might be something like a preemptive step before the ICJ might, I mean, or not ICJ, maybe domestic law can bring them to court or something?
Well, I don't think anybody has much doubt from the tenor of all the ICJ rulings lately, from the ICJ ruling on whether or not to take the case in South Africa against Israel, to the entire tone of the ICJ remarks in their ruling on the status of the occupied territories, where they basically completely sank the Western defense that normal international law has been modified by the Oslo Accords, and therefore the status of the occupied territories is somehow in doubt and not entirely legal. The ICJ completely demolished that argument. So I personally, I've no doubt that the ICJ will find genocide in 2 or 3 years' time. We'll find Israel is currently committing genocide. When that happens, if the ICJ says this is genocide, then this is genocide. UK courts will not say it wasn't a genocide if the ICJ said it was. No UK court is going to contradict that. So then the question of complicity in that genocide becomes a very real legal question. And politicians will feel, of course, they have impunity because it's a politician who is the Attorney General. It is politicians who run the country. But nonetheless, I see it's going to be very, very difficult once the ICJ says this was a genocide for certainly the previous Conservative government to argue it was not complicit in the genocide, and very difficult for Keir Starmer to argue he was not complicit in the genocide. And we've had referred to, of course, all the things he said about Israel's right to cut off water, its right to cut off food, and the fact that they're continuing to go with the vast majority of arms exports to Israel at a time this is continuing. So they may feel that they are powerful, they are in charge, the rule of law will not really work, and they have impunity. But they will have the doubt at the back of their mind. And the important thing is the government's own legal advisors are advising them that it would be illegal to continue. And my understanding is that the distinction that they have tried to make between some parts and other parts, and David Lammy initially in public tried to justify that as a distinction between defensive weapons and offensive weapons. So there's no rational sense in which an F-35 is a defensive weapon and not an offensive weapon, particularly the way it's being used in Gaza. And in the end, they didn't rely on that in what they've published. But their attempt to find some nationalization, some justification, some fig leaf, just to secure their legal position is what we are seeing here. And it is not political, it is much more legal. Yes, it does to some extent appease the pro-Palestinian sentiment for them to be seen to be doing something, but that's not really what this is about, because it's tiny, it doesn't go very far. And there's no doubt at all that Lammy and Starmer are both ardent Zionists. They're both members of Labour Friends of Israel.